there, and welcome to The Gathering. My name's Maddie. I'm the online host here. I want to thank you for being in worship with us today. Now, if you're new to our channel or you haven't yet, be sure to go and subscribe and then turn on notifications. Sermons like this drop every Sunday. They're available all week long on demand. But then you can head to the description of this video to find a link to our website to learn more about our church, a link to give if you're interested in that today, and a link to a Connect card, which lets us know that you are here so that we can reach out and help you get more connected. Today, we are in week 2 of our series, Beloved Community. And this is a very important series, a very big conversation that we're having around the role of racial justice in the church and what it looks like for us as faithful Christians to embrace racial justice, to do the work that we have personally, to begin unpacking some of the bias that we have within ourselves, which is a conversation we're going to have today. Last week, we talked about the sin of racism, and we named racism as a sin, and we unpacked what that means. I encourage you, if you have not watched it yet, to go back and watch it. It's a really, really good sermon. And today, we're going to continue that conversation. And I know that this is a big topic, but I'm really excited and eager to be a part of it. I think that for me, knowing that I have work to do to be a more loving neighbor, a more loving friend, a more loving family member, like that is something I can acknowledge in every other area of my life, including this one. And being able to sit in discomfort a little bit with a community that I love and care for makes this conversation approachable. And so I'm excited to get to engage that with you today. So I hope that you listen to the whole message, share this with someone that it might resonate with, and make sure to come back next week because we are going to have a guest preacher. Reverend Adrienne Ewell is going to join us to continue this conversation. I'm really, really excited to have her a part of this dialogue. You get to learn from her. She's awesome. She's so great. Make sure that you come back because I think she's going to add a lot more depth to an already very deep conversation. So come back next week to catch Reverend Adrienne. Go back and listen to last week's message if you have not yet already. And as always, if you enjoyed this, share it with a friend. See you next week.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Gathering. Thank you so much for being in worship with us today. So several years ago, I made a big mistake. Now, to be clear, I've made a lot of big mistakes since then, but this one just sticks out to me. I was here at our McCausland site out in the lobby greeting people before worship, and a young woman came in with two very young kids, and I was getting to know her. We were talking, and she said, "Oh, a friend of mine from work invited me to the gathering." And I said, "That's fantastic. Where do you work?" And she said, "Oh, I work over at Children's Hospital." And just immediately I said, "Oh, are you a nurse there?" And she said, "No, I'm a doctor." And in that instant, I knew that I had messed up. Now, why did I mess up? Well, I messed up because I made this assumption about her. I mean, it was unconscious. It was unintentional. It was in an instant, but I made an assumption that because she was young, because she was a woman, she must have been a nurse. Now, that assumption likely came from all sorts of factors, stereotypes that we see socially, the culture that I was raised in, TV and media depictions of who a doctor is and who a nurse is. But regardless of where it came from, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't intend to do it, but I messed up. I let a bias creep in to how I viewed another person. Today, we're continuing our series called The Beloved Community, Pursuing Racial Justice. And if you were here last week, I really want to thank you for being here. If you weren't here, there's a few things that I shared last week just about the series as a whole that I really want to revisit very quickly. First, I talked about the format of the series, that I'm going to be preaching the first 2 weeks, that we're going to have guest preachers preaching the last 2 weeks. I really hope you're here for all 4 weeks. But Pastor Charity made the conscious decision not to preach, and she shared last week with the congregation why she made that decision. I thought it was a really important moment for us, and I want you to see it if you missed it. So check this out.
Hey church, Pastor Charity here. If we haven't met before, I'm the pastor of spiritual formation in groups. I'm so grateful that we are tackling this timely and difficult discussion around racism in this, our Beloved Community sermon series. I designed this series, and Matt and I sat down to outline what we think is most important to talk about in it. Now, while I shaped the series, I made the decision not to preach during this series. And for some of you, that may sound odd, but here's why. Discussing race and racism takes emotional labor for people of color. Frankly, it is exhausting. Therefore, I'm choosing self care during this series. Also, too often the misconception is that, or the held belief is that Black people or people of color are supposed to teach white people about racism. And that's just not true. It's not our responsibility. It is, in fact, healthy and needed for white people to discuss racism, as well as learn and unlearn ways of being amongst themselves. Now, as your pastor and as people that I love, I have three things to ask of you during this series. You ready? The first is to show up. Be here every week. It's going to be intentional and really beautiful, I believe, as well as challenging. Second, sit in the discomfort. Yes, sit in the discomfort. You may feel discomfort at points in the service, but please hold it. In the most minute way, by doing so, you're gaining a glimpse of the exponential discomfort some of us live with every day. And with that said, I ask that you be mindful that your reaction may be to unload this discomfort in unhealthy ways, such as going to a person of color and seeking their words or their hugs. But please resist the urge to do so and sit with the discomfort. Third, site pastors will be sharing more about this later today, but participate in the free faith-based implicit bias course that's being offered. I know that this is an important topic to you as well, and I ask that you honor my decision and the presence of people of color in our congregation as we take initial steps to create the beloved community. God bless you.
Secondly, and along with that, I'm really asking us as a congregation to be open in this series. Most of you are. Most of you were, even in the wake of last week. Thank you to those of you who just engaged the message. But I know that some of you, it made you a little angry. And that's okay with me, but I want to reiterate that I think this series is important, not just to help our church to welcome more people, but it's personal too. I think that racism is something that all of us interact with, and we swim in waters where this impacts us, even if you think it doesn't. And so I don't just want it to challenge our church to be more open. I wanted to challenge you to think about how racism might show up in your own life. If you were here last week, I really argued in the message that racism is a historical and present reality in American life. It's not just something from the past, but it is also something in the present. And I also made a theological claim that racism is a sin. We talked about why it's a sin and how it's a sin. But ultimately, in the face of sin, Christians are called to do three things. We're called to recognize it, that's confessing it. We're called to repent of it or begin to turn and move in a different direction. And we're called to resist it, to actively push it away. And so last week really was a lot of recognizing, just recognizing what racism is, the ways it's shown up historically, and the ways that it still impacts our life today, keeping us from fully loving God, fully loving other people, and even fully loving ourselves and becoming the people that God intended us to be. Today, though, I want to move on, and we're going to talk about another factor, another way in which this racism impacts us, and we're going to begin that turning around, that repenting, moving in a new direction in our life. But I want to talk today about how we've been conditioned by racism to see each other. Especially how historical discrimination can distort how we see each other even today. There is a technical term for this sort of distorted way of seeing other people, and it's called unconscious or implicit bias. Let me put a definition up. Implicit or unconscious bias is attitudes or stereotypes that we have about people without our conscious knowledge. My opening story was a great example of this. Unconscious bias is when we make a snap judgment based on stereotypes, cultural attitudes, assumptions that we make. But this is especially true and pervasive when it comes to race. And because of a history of racism, white people do this all the time when it comes to the ways that we view or treat or talk to Black people specifically and people of color more broadly in this country. And because this kind of bias is unconscious, It means that we don't intend to do it. It influences you nonetheless, whether you mean it to or not. And there's something important that I really want to point out. You don't have to be racist to be influenced by racism. Most of us are not actively trying to be racist, but nonetheless, we're all influenced by the racism that has been part of this country. Despite your intentions, despite your best effort, your behavior still might have a negative impact on someone else. Even if someone isn't trying to be prejudiced, even if the stereotypes aren't your fault, even if you believe that color shouldn't matter, historical discrimination, negative stereotypes and assumptions that our country has made about people of color still distorts the way that we see. And this distorted way of seeing isn't new to us. I mean, this has been happening throughout human history. In the Bible, a large part of Jesus' own ministry was helping God's people to see differently so that they could respond differently. I mean, in Jesus' own time, there were all sorts of historic discriminations that distorted the way that the disciples were able to see. And Jesus was constantly pushing the disciples to see people differently, to see them in a new way. But they were impacted by discrimination, the way that they saw women, the way that they saw Gentiles, the way that they saw people who were sick or who had disease, the way that they saw those with disabilities, or the way that they saw children in many cases. All this was impacted by the stereotypes of their time. And Jesus was constantly pushing his disciples to confront these distorted ways of seeing so they could change the way they treated God's people. Now, there's all sorts of examples of this in the New Testament. Perhaps the most famous example I think of this is a parable that Jesus tells in Luke. It's called the Good Samaritan. And I'm going to read the story in just one second, but most of you are likely familiar with the Good Samaritan. Most of us think it's a story about helping other people. It is sort of about that, but I think even more than that, it's really a story about how do we see others. Before I read the parable, let me just remind you that Jesus told this story in response to a legal expert. This was a good guy, a very religious guy who asked Jesus, hey, Jesus, who is my neighbor? You tell us we're supposed to love our neighbor. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds with this story. I want you to listen to it, then we're going to talk about it. It says, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now, it just so happened that a priest was also going down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by the spot, saw the injured man, crossed over to the other side of the road, went on his way. And then a Samaritan who was on a journey came to where the man was. But when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending them with oil and wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, took care of him. The next day, took 2 full days' worth of wages and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs. What do you think? Which one of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? Okay, so Jesus being Jesus, never can just answer the question straight. Who is my neighbor? Jesus tells this story. And he says there is this guy, and he's certainly a Jewish guy. He's traveling the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, a very well-traveled road for Jewish people. And this man suddenly was beaten up. He was robbed. He was left for dead. Now, there's a lot of ways that you could read this story, a lot of people you can identify with. But for today, I want you to identify with this guy, the guy that got robbed. You're the person who got robbed. You got beaten. Now you're laying on the ground. You cannot get up. You need help. And you're laying there and wondering, what in the world are you going to do? And then all of a sudden, story says, a priest starts walking down the road. And you are so relieved. As you lay there, you see the priest. You can tell that this person is a priest from the way that they're dressed. And you could not have asked for a luckier coincidence. I mean, after all, you know this priest is going to help you, right? Priests are good. They love God. They know the law. They want to help their neighbors. I mean, that's kind of their whole deal. And so you see this priest coming towards you. You even start to shout and yell to make sure the priest sees you. And then all of a sudden, the priest makes eye contact with you and then very quickly averts his eyes. He crosses the road and he walks right on by you. Everything that you assumed and thought about the priest is disrupted. And so you're still laying there. And then next a Levite comes. Now, a Levite was also a temple worker, a priest of sorts. And you're thinking to yourself, thank God no one gets this lucky. Another temple person, another priest. I mean, this guy's Jewish. He's part of the temple. He loves God. He loves neighbor. He will certainly want to help me. I mean, this is a person who's all about good deeds. Everything in your experience tells you this is your guy. The first guy just must have been a fluke. And then same thing. He sees you. He crosses over. He walks on by you despite you shouting and trying to get his attention. Your stereotype fails again. And so you're laying there. You still can't get up. You're really in a lot of pain. And then you see another guy coming around the corner. But this guy is a Samaritan. You can tell by the way he looks and the way he dresses. Upon seeing him, you just groan. I mean, how unlucky could you be? Samaritans are hated by your people, by the way. They are the enemies of yours. They neither worship the right God, they don't worship in the right place. They live across the tracks, literally in a different part of Palestine. You don't eat the same foods. You don't sit down at the same tables. Everything that you've been taught to think, every cultural cue you've ever picked up tells you this guy is trouble. So you just try to make yourself small. You just do not want this guy to see you. You'll take your chances with whoever's next, but despite your best efforts to be still and to look small, this guy spots you. And he not only spots you, but he starts walking toward you. And you think, oh no, this guy's coming toward me. He comes right up over to you. And you're thinking to yourself, I can't believe it. A dang Samaritan. What is this guy gonna do? Rob me again or something even worse? But that's not what he does. Instead, he bends down and he helps you. He begins to attend to your wounds. Not only that, but he gets you up and he takes you with him. He gets you to a place of safety, to an inn. He stays the night with you. He makes sure that you can be cared for there. He pays for all of it and promises to check back on you. Suddenly, everything that you thought about who a Samaritan was turned upside down. And then Jesus asks the question, who was a neighbor to this man? And of course, the answer is the most unexpected person, the Samaritan, the one that anyone hearing the story would have been the least likely to see as the neighbor. That's the person that you were really waiting for. So you see how this parable works. I mean, in essence, Jesus is challenging the legal expert's way of seeing. He's challenging the biases, the stereotypes, the assumptions that he was making. He challenged the stereotypes of who was a neighbor, who was a friend, who was worth being in relationship with, and who was an enemy, and what a foreigner really was like. And who was dangerous or who was threatening. He mixed it all up so that he could invite the legal expert to see people differently, to see anew. By challenging the biases that the legal expert had, he changed the view that this guy had about who his neighbor really was. Jesus helped him to see past or see through those social assumptions, the way he was raised, the religious and geographical differences, all of these distortions that he carried with him. Jesus changed the way that he saw the Samaritan. And so in the story, the Samaritan goes from a dangerous threat to a generous neighbor. Now, friends, this story is a parable. It was meant to challenge that guy, sure, but it was also meant to speak to all of us who would read it after. It was meant to challenge how we see people and maybe to begin to change the way that we see and view and treat the people that are around us. It was a parable that was meant to challenge the assumptions that we carry around about most people in our own lives. Another word for these assumptions, these stereotypes that the story is addressing, is this word bias, this unconscious or implicit bias. And friends, here's the thing. You can't avoid having it. We all have it. Let's just consider this. Neuroscientists have shown that at any given time, the human brain is taking in like 11 million pieces of information from everything in the world around it. But we can only consciously process about 40 pieces of information at a time. And so what that means is our brain has to have all sorts of shortcuts for how we respond and do things in the world. We have all sorts of shortcuts, processes, little subconscious kind of mental filters and assumptions that our brain has to make, allowing us to quickly make decisions about any number of things that we see in our life. Now, when it comes to race specifically, here's the problem. White people, especially in this country, have grown up in an environment that just has racism all over it. But our brains, don't necessarily realize that we're doing this. But what we are doing is we've been conditioned to associate certain attributes with certain kinds of people. And without us knowing it, our brain will pick up those attributes. And when it comes to people of color or Black people specifically, we have stereotypes, we have assumptions that we have picked up from the world around us without us even consciously realizing it. Let me give you a quick history and example of how this works. Many of the racial stereotypes that we have about Black people formed in this country, especially kind of post-Civil War. White leaders in that time, news people, politicians, even performers who went around the country, began to intentionally shape specific stereotypes about people of color and Black people. And those stereotypes began to spread and kind of soaked into the subconscious of our country. These early stereotypes, you can go and you can read about them, you can study. These early stereotypes included like the happy slave or the mammy, which was a Black woman who was a domestic worker, or the savage, a person of color who was exotic and threatening and dangerous. And these stereotypes over time morphed and adapted and changed, but they never really went away. These stereotypes gave rise to really pervasive falsehoods, like Black workers being lazy, or the 1980s gave us the stereotype of the welfare queen or the crack addict. Even today, these stereotypes persist with new ones, like the affirmative action pick, or the angry Black woman, or the DEI hire. And these stereotypes are still today reinforced by what we see on the news and the way people are portrayed in media, the way politicians talk about people, and what we see them, how we see them portrayed in movies and on TV and music. And all of this has had a profound effect on how so many white people in this country came to view people of color. I know this because it impacted me. I grew up in a small town that was nearly all white. I went to an elementary school where every student in the school was white. In fact, over time, I really only knew two Black girls that were in my school who were adopted by a white family. And what this meant is that all my information, all my views of Black people or other people of color came from what I saw on TV, what I saw on the news, the way that adults talked about people of color. All of it came from these indirect assumptions and stereotypes. And it wasn't really until like middle school when I started playing sports, really. It was AAU basketball that really shattered this for me. It was then that I finally began to have personal relationships with people who weren't white. And that began to change and push back against so many of the stereotypes that I grew up with. Now I know that I'm not the only one with that experience in here. There are a lot of white people who are listening right now who grew up with distorted ways of seeing people of color. And then we act out of it. We don't do it on purpose. Even if we don't intend to, though, it changes the way we act and it negatively impacts people that we are meant to love. You know, a few years ago, the New York Times did a short video on growing up Black in America. In one small part, some young men talked about how this implicit bias has impacted their own lives. Check this out.
Racism means basically like
A large part of a race feels that they're superior to another race. And so not only do they believe that, but they act on it. I was walking home from school with this one white girl, and we just gone off the bus, and we were almost home, and there were these group of Black kids that just gone out of school. And she was like, "Oh, let's cross the street. There's a group of Black kids. I don't want to run into them." And so she told me, which I don't even know why she would do that.
I used to wear a sweatband like just to reinforce my wrist. And I had a teacher come up to me and say, "You should take it off because it looks gang affiliated."
I've been in situations where, I had to cross the street because I didn't want to scare the white lady that was walking.
It would get to the point where I would start to count how many times a woman would clutch her bag.
When I was 16, I was leaving my mom's house in my pajamas, which had snowmen on them, with my brother, and we were actually stopped by the police rather aggressively. I've been stopped by the cops on my way between classes because we have two separate buildings, walking from one building to the other building, as my white students in the same class walk by me.
It's kind of upsetting because we live in a world where my mom has to be afraid when I walk outside from the people that are like meant to protect me. And I don't like when my mother feels like that. I love my mother. I want her to always be happy.
You see, a legacy of racism has shaped the way white people see. And many of us have unconsciously been shaped to make assumptions about Black people, seeing them as dangerous or lazy or addicted or angry or somehow less deserving. But friends, it's not just Black people. This has been true in this country when it comes to how we view Asian Americans, how we view Native Americans, more recently, how we view people from the Middle East or people who are Muslim. And these stereotypes are still actively being created today. I think about what my kids are going to grow up with, how my kids are going to view certain people, what's going to be in their brain when they hear Mexicans called rapists, or when they hear Venezuelans being associated with gang members, or Haitian immigrants who supposedly eat dogs and cats. All of this stuff it gets into how we think about people. People are being stereotyped on a near daily basis in our news and in our politics, from our leaders and on TV. And the effects can be devastating. And so when you uncover all this, when you just begin to notice it, it can seem kind of insurmountable. But there are some specific things we can do. This is the good news. It doesn't have to be this way. And we can, with work, change it. In fact, as we close, there are three things that I want to challenge you to do when it comes to this idea of unconscious bias in your life. I'm going to talk more about how you can learn about these. But the first one is, I first just want you to see it. I mean, Jesus uses a parable to confront the legal expert with his implicit bias. He just wants him to see that he treats people differently based on stereotypes. We can do a better job of just noticing this in our own life when we're treating one another out of an assumption or a stereotype that we're making. We're called to see it. Secondly, we're called to question it. I mean, Jesus, through the parable, invites the man to question who his neighbor really is, to explore kind of the reason that he made a snap assumption about who his neighbor is. And we can do this too. When we notice that we make these assumptions about other people, we can ask ourselves why. Where did that assumption come from? Is that assumption true? Why do I react in certain ways without even knowing it? And then thirdly, when we see it, when we question it, we can begin to transform it. I mean, of course, through the story, Jesus transforms the man's bias by challenging him to see differently, to view his neighbor differently than he did before. And friends, Jesus does the same for us. He's constantly transforming us so that we can see people as he sees people. Practically, I think there are some ways that you can begin to address and transform this bias in your own life. I mean, first, take the implicit bias training. A lot of this information comes out of that. And I know we asked you to do that last week. Some of you were confused. It was a little confusing on how to sign up. But if you go to Next Steps, there's going to be a banner right there, a virtual implicit bias training. And you can see it. Click on it. The online course is one that you can do by yourself, and then you can process it in core group or sign up to process it along with other people. But I hope all of you will do it. You can begin to address this by just spending time with other people. Be mindful of how you react. Just slow down before you make assumptions about others. Be humble and ask questions of your friends and people that you're in relationship with. Don't just go up to random people and start asking them questions, but be curious with the people that you're friends with, the people that you're in relationships with. And then just regularly reflect on how you're reacting and why. All of these things can begin to help us to see differently, to transform those biases that we grew up with. Friends, as I end, let me just say this. I think in the wake of unconscious bias, there's kind of two things that we can do. Some of us are just going to scoff and say, that isn't on me. I don't do that. We can resist thinking about it, and we can just rest comfortably in the idea that I'm not a racist. Some of you are going to do that, but I'm asking you to be open. There's this other option where we can see that even though we may not intentionally try to treat people differently, we do, just based on these assumptions and these stereotypes. And here's the thing, those biases, if we don't address them, they're going to rob us of what could be really beautiful and authentic relationships with other people that are different. But here's the hope, here's the promise, here's, I think, the really good news. We can actually do something about this. Jesus invites us to do something about this. Jesus empowers us to do something about this. And Jesus gives us the ability to see other people differently. Jesus can help us to see people anew. And friends, when we begin to do that, it will transform not only your experience of others, but it'll change the way that they experience you. It can change you both in a positive way. So biases that used to distort and hurt can be transformed into ways of seeing that ultimately help us all to flourish. And I think that's what Jesus wants. Let's pray. Gracious and holy God, I'm so grateful for the way that Jesus taught us to think and to see and to change. He didn't always just give the answers, but through stories like the one that we wrestled with today, we can see the ways in which we are like that legal expert. That we have set ideas about who people are and who they're supposed to be. But God, I pray that you can give us new eyes. For all the ways that we make snap judgments and assumptions about people, forgive us and help us today to do the work of seeing and questioning and transforming those biases so that we can see one another as you see us. God, I pray that we would be a church that's open to this work, that's open to that transformation, so that ultimately our church right here can look like your kingdom, which is in heaven. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.